Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos. Today we're going to be looking at CompTIA's Project Plus. Specifically, we'll be identifying our Agile basics for our methodology. So we have with us today Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, thank you for being with us today. Where do we start? How do we learn these methods?
Well, when we start to take a look at the idea of using an Agile methodology, one of the things that we wanted to begin with is you might be wondering why. If you've come from the world of programming, you understand kind of the benefits of the Agile method, but if you come from the world of project management outside of the IT world a lot of times, you probably go, wait a minute, that's so different than anything that we've talked about in terms of project management. So when you start talking about the idea of just project management, so we'll do a basic comparison here, and then we'll show you a diagram that I hope will help to explain it a little bit better as well. So when you start talking about project management, remember the phases that we tend to go through, right? The initiation, the planning, the execution, as well as controlling kind of going hand in hand. And then we have the closing, and in CompTIA land, we also have, of course, the training, which ends everything, okay? But in all of those stages, the way that it's designed is that one stage builds upon the next. So the closing actually builds upon what we've actually done in the execution and the controlling stage. The execution and controlling builds upon what we actually did in the planning stage. Planning, of course, builds upon and expands on the initiation stage as well, so that at the very end you get this big, gigantic product, okay, which is really what we hope is that our project really does deliver through on that unique result, product, or even a service that we have, and that everything's going to be satisfactory. Well, the problem that we have in terms of just regular project management is that as effective as it is, it doesn't really lend itself to changes that may happen over time during the project at any particular point. If you want to make changes in project management in the way that we've talked about it so far, it's easier to make changes in the initiation phase. It's easier to make changes during the planning phase. Once you get into the execution phase, though, that's when changes now become burdensome. They become complex. They become things in which you would rather not have to deal with.
Yeah, we even saw where we might have to go ahead and submit those changes to a change advisory board.
Yeah, some type of change advisory board is usually what ends up happening there. And so what starts to happen is that you start to realize something, that a lot of small projects, changes like that might be incredibly a hassle to you, but you might still be told, you're still going to have to do it. I still want that in there. I don't care what it takes, you still need to do it. And then you find out that you really do have to kind of go, all right, well, for us to do that, we have to retool something else, or we have to actually reshape something that we did 6 weeks ago to make sure that element gets included in. So instead, what has started to happen in the realm of project management is simple, is that they started looking at other areas that were highly technical in terms of the processes that they did, and they chose the idea of agile types of management. And this is normally done in the software realm, in the developer realm, because of how easily they're able to take on changes, and they don't take on long-term planning in the way that regular project management talks about it. So let's take a look at a diagram that will help us to figure this out so that we can see a little bit more graphically, and hopefully it'll stick into your mind and do this. Okay? So in the way that Agile works is that they compare everything to the way that we used to do things, right? So if you're developing some type of software, the traditional approach is simple. You do analysis, and then you design the software, then you start actually coding the software. In other words, doing the work, ultimately testing it at the very end here, you end up with the software that somebody requested, okay? Now, notice that how everything actually depends on the other thing before. I can't test anything unless I've already gone through analysis, design, and coding. I can't code anything if I haven't designed anything and I haven't actually done analysis that helps me to figure out what it is I'm actually coding for. So when you start doing that, the real test is that deliverable at the end, whether or not that product, that software actually works the way that we want it to. So in that same way, it's like project management, right? The initiation, the planning, the execution, the controlling, and then the closing, and then of course the testing there when you add in the CompTIA language, right? Then at the end you have that product. You have everything that you want. But this is where it becomes difficult when changes happen, right? If you're in the middle of coding and now the sponsor of your project says, hey, here's an extra element I want you to add in. Well, remember, you've already designed what it's supposed to look like. You've already designed what you think is the end and what you agreed upon with that sponsor, that's the end, okay? And so all of this designing may have actually taken, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks to design, and now you're 3 weeks into coding, and now somebody says, oh, I need you to add this in there. Well, now you can't just go, well, I'm just going to add that in later on and we'll just continue testing. You might actually find yourself having to start all over before you can get to that point again. The way that Agile actually does this is a little bit different in this way. Agile says, look, here's what we want to do instead, okay? There is no long-term planning as a requirement. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they don't want to see the software that they want to develop at the very end? No, that's not what they mean. What they mean instead is that they work in smaller, workable units in this way. That they plan a little bit and they say, what's going to actually help us to have our first step to give us the overall product? And then they work on that as hard as they can, and then they work on the next step. And what they really end up accomplishing at the very end is they have the product, the software that they want, not because they were all working towards the end result in that way, but that everybody along the project was working on smaller projects that ended up the result of that, the result of those ended up adding up into the entire project itself. So in everything that they do, you take a look at it in a vertical manner in this way. Let me see if I can emphasize that a little bit more for the first step there. So that bolder green line indicates that when we begin to start working at this point, we just go, all right, how do we subdivide up what this big, gigantic project is going to be into smaller workable chunks here and smaller goals? And then we do an analysis for each one of those particular workable units. And then we design and we code and we test right there before we move on.
So Ronnie, if we look at our smaller workable chunks here, is there any kind of set duration or any kind of recommendations that you have?
Well, yes and no, right? Like anything else, it depends on the world that you work in. In the software development world, usually these particular smaller chunks are done in particular time units that are set, right? So normally 1 to 4 weeks, depending on how large the project is. By default, I want to say de facto instead, not by default. De facto, most software development teams that tend to work in this manner of Agile, at least from what I could actually find out, it's about a 2-week sprint is what they normally end up working out as. So what can we accomplish in 10 days of workable time that will give us at the end result here, if we take a look at my screen again, that unit that we really want. We want some type of deliverable at the end of each one of these. Now, the thing that makes this different, right, because we don't plan for the entirety of the whole project, is that at the end of this, we might find out something. We now go back, and after testing, we might find out, Ronnie, you got software that's a dud, it doesn't work. Well, it didn't mean that I worked the whole time, and now I have to start all over. It means on that particular unit, I worked, and now I might need to actually go back in and start all over if I need to. Or I might find out through testing that I got a portion of code that's bad. Well, then I just jump back into coding and I rerun that process and that loop again until we get it right. Now, once it's actually done, we can then move on to that second unit, and it's there that you start the same process again. And this is why it's actually called Agile, because it willingly accepts changes. Somebody adds something in during the design stage, during the coding stage, well, you just simply start that process over again, and then you still end up with that smaller unit that you're really heading a goal towards to help you out. And so each process is really that loop, or it actually leads on to the second stage, which gives us a smaller unit again, third, fourth, fifth, however many that there are. And at the end, the result of all of those small projects is what gives us the overall project itself, is what we really want. So the nature of Agile is what is considered the iterative approach. Now, Cherokee, have you heard of this idea of an iterative approach before?
I have not.
You have not? Well, this is what we mean here when we talk about an iterative approach. Instead of saying the way that we talk about a project, right? We said that a project has what? A definite beginning and a definite end, but it doesn't specify a duration in between. Now, you may be wondering, like, why in the world is that important? Well, remember that in project management here, okay? We have those 3 constraints, right? time, scope, right, and cost, if you kind of remember that in your mind, okay? Usually there's one of those elements that is considered kind of the absolute there, right? The unchanging constant that we have. And in a project management, that's going to be the idea of scope or requirements, okay? Right? The project sponsor really wants to see that product. So that means that for you and I to affect the project any, okay, the two variables that we really have to keep in balance are time as well as the cost is what we have to keep in mind, okay? Now, in the way that Agile works instead, it kind of inverts that idea instead. It says this, it says, look, time and cost are essentially the two that are really not, are not movable, right? They are the constants. And so that's what allows you to take that requirement and say, here's the overall thing that Ronnie wants to see. How do I break that up into smaller units or smaller projects that will give Ronnie ultimately what he wants to see instead? So it doesn't matter if Ronnie says, here's what I want to see at the end. It now matters what the team says. This is what will give Ronnie what he wants to see at the very end result instead. So now they can switch the requirements up, and then they have the constant of what they realize. There's a particular time element that they want to do everything in, and it's going to have a particular cost associated with that. And so normally this is that iterative approach where we have between 1 to 4 weeks, usually by de facto, it's a 2-week, what they call a sprint idea is what you tend to get, okay? So that idea of a sprint is really that iterative approach where they really work as hard as they can for that span of time where they begin the analysis, designing, coding, and testing, and at the end of that, that's what they want to have is some type of deliverable as well. Now, along with this type of approach comes the idea of teams that have to be willing to work together very efficiently as well. And the unusual thing about these teams in the iterative approach is that you as a project manager, you don't assign them. You as a project manager essentially just says, here's what Ronnie wants to see. Let's go ahead and break this down in our analysis to see what we can do, okay? Then it's the team that's actually going to work on this that's going to organize themselves, right? So we're talking about the idea of what we call self-organized and self-directed types of teams that will actually kind of do the work and decide how those requirements will break down for us, okay? So it's very important that we have this because it's not me as a project manager that knows all of the details and technical details that need to be done. It's the team that does, and they know how they actually work best effectively as well, okay? So when we start to take a look at that then, that means that these teams are not people that we just go, it's okay, we'll just grab Cherokee, we'll grab Peter, we'll grab Megan out of this and just throw it together.
These members have to be really coherent and responsible. So what are some characteristics that you might look for, Ronnie? Because you can't, like you're saying, you can't just pick some random individuals.
Yeah, well, you could if you were just doing stuff, right? If you just said you wanted to play, let's say a pickup game of basketball, definitely you could do something like that. But because we have that, where we have two of our requirements and projects, right, that are constrained at all times, they're constantly constrained, cost as well as time, it means that for you to get those requirements done, the other variables that you have to be able to change are then, well, going to be things like resources, and that means that your team has to have certain characteristics or properties. One of those, of course, is just plain competency in what you're doing, okay? That means they have the actual skills that they need for the job that they're about to see ahead. So competency makes a big difference here. You cannot take the time during these sprints to say, Ronnie, you don't know how to do this. Let me train you as we continue to go on and do this. At this point, if they're in part of a sprint, they're expected to already be competent in the skills. Now, you might go, well, that's kind of harsh and unfair. But remember that we're constrained by what? Time and money. It's different if we're not constrained by those two, that those two are going to be fairly variable here. But they're not. So that's why we have to expect and we have to make sure that we have competency too. The other thing, of course, is good collaboration between those self-organizing teams. The great thing is you don't have to assign them. Those teams, if they've worked together for a while, and so one of the other characteristics that you tend to see is that these people have actually had continuity. They've worked together for a bit of time to really help it out. But they also have collaboration. In other words, they encourage the idea of teamwork. It's not about, Cherokee making sure that Cherokee gets top billing.
Right.
Okay?
If I'm able to go ahead and identify some strengths and weaknesses of certain individuals, I'm going to put people where I can get the best out of every, potential role there.
Yeah, that's really going to be a key element in helping out. So collaboration, the idea of competency, the idea of some continuity because these people work together, it really does help out, as well as motivation. And so these sprints are actually designed to be very motivating to people that work together, that yes, we can accomplish this in 10 days. Yes, it can be done, and
You
those
can
teams
do
have to do it.
it.
Yes, it really is. It's kind of strange, but that's what you want. You want the idea of the team to really be in it for that team effort, to the point where they are actually both interested in what they really need to do, as well as focused on what they need to do. And this is not just a I'll work on it when I get the chance idea, right? So during these sprints, everybody has to be focused as well as interested in what they're doing, okay? And of course, trust and respect is also a key in this type of self-directed team as well, okay? They all understand that they go in for the team win as well. So usually I don't want to say the motto, but the unspoken idea.
The camaraderie.
Yeah, the camaraderie is fairly simple. They win as a team or they lose as a team, okay? It's not the idea that one individual succeeds and everybody else fails, and that individual gets to go, rah, see, I did my part, I'm great at this. You guys, you're terrible at this. It's not that idea. There is that idea of team spirit that we really do focus in on, and they have the trust and respect that this is what's going to happen as well, okay? So now, when you have all those elements that are involved in that particular type of team, the result then is that you have people that are now really focused in on making sure that there is some deliverable at the end of every iteration, okay? At the end of every 2-week sprint, at the end of that time period, that you have something that you can show for that, because you have a very self-directed team that said, yes, we can do it. You have competent people that know that you can do it as well, and now they want to make sure they accomplish those goals too. Now, during this entire time, okay, because they're not planning the entirety of the whole project out, they're only worried about those 2-week sprints at a time, it makes it very easy for them to continuously reevaluate, okay? Take a look at the requirements that they're actually having and see if there are any more requirements that need to be added in. So the Agile method is very good at actually saying, all right, another requirement comes in, great. The good thing is we're only partway through this process, and if that's a requirement for this iteration, we'll definitely be able to incorporate it right in without there really being any type of major change that has to go on. And that's because they're not focused on the whole project. They're really only saying, all right, on this part, that change that you requested, Ronnie, we can incorporate it, but we're really not even there yet. Or, yes, we can incorporate that right in because we're only working on this part right now. So we don't have to worry about the entirety of the whole thing, because once we get that part in that now Ronnie has added an extra requirement in, we know that for the next iteration, we now have a new requirement, and then that means that the next sprint has incorporated that in already, and now you're actually adding that throughout the entire project, and you're getting that. So it's kind of a very neat methodology that allows for projects to be done fairly quickly and be able to change when they need to without having to kind of slow down and figure out what effect is that going to have on the project later on down the line. So there's a lot of information here that we do have to make sure that we gather up and do this. You might wonder why? Why? Well, you got to remember that users will constantly change their mind. At the very end, they see a good product that you're beginning to work on, and then they go, you want to know something? I bet you they could add this in there really quickly. And Agile teams, they don't mind that so much. Don't get me wrong, it could be a headache, okay? But at the same time, because of the way that the Agile methodology works, they tend to be able to incorporate it fairly quickly without there being a lot of massive changes that have to go on in the background, because they're really working in those incremental units for that deliverable that they have. Okay?
Definitely a lot more manageable there than having to go back and rework from the beginning if we're just focusing on those sprints.
All right, so what do we really need to do then once we start talking about this idea of using some type of Agile methodology? The very basics here, okay? Well, let's take a look at my screen, and I've listed out some to try and help us out, okay? First and foremost, the way that we get started here is we establish what we call a backlog, okay? Now, notice this. It says, make a list of features that will become the work for the project, okay? The work to do for the project. Now, even though this is a to-do list of sorts, it is not only that, okay? The idea of what we're creating here, right, is the very beginning that we actually do have a list of the items that we really need to go ahead and be able to accomplish. But the way that Agile works with this is that they call it building the backstory, right? The user stories is what they call it, okay? So every single task that we have, there normally is associated a story behind that. Now, it doesn't mean there has to be a long, elaborate story, but it might be, this is the way that Cherokee would interface with my software, okay? So Cherokee is on an iPhone. So what do I need to do to get that accomplished? Or Cherokee is on an Android. What does, it's the idea of actually saying, here it is. Here's it broken down into that workable unit, but that there's a story behind it as well. But this backlog is also considered a prioritized list as well, okay? And then the work that we tend to do inside of each of the sprints is that once we've actually accomplished one of those items that's done, okay, in this backlog, if there's more that needs to be done or if we've finished with the entire program, what we now need to do is go ahead and pull more from this idea of what they call that backlog. Now, if you're like me, you kind of came to this and go, what the heck, backlog? That's usually a bad thing, right? Normally when I think about a backlog, it's like things that should have been done that weren't done, but in the world of Agile and Scrum methodologies here, or Scrum method, they really love this idea of a backlog as meaning that very highly prioritized list of things that need to be done.
So what's so special about this backlog? You say that they love it, but could you explain that a little bit more?
It's because it really is something that they don't have to guess at what needs to be done next. If you now have the entirety of everything that really needs to be done for that particular sprint all listed there, what it means is your particular team then, when they start working, you don't have to assign them, you better work on this task, you better work on this task, you better work on this task. They can look at that list and go, here's what I'm going to start working on. Here's what I'm going to start working on. Here's what I'm going to start working on. Cherokee gets finished before I do on mine. She doesn't have to sit around and wait for the project manager to tell her what to do next. Why? Because we have a backlog. So Cherokee simply goes into the backlog and checks off the elements and goes, okay, Ronnie's working here, Megan's working here, Peter's working here. Oh, here's the 3 items left in this particular sprint that needs to be worked on. Cherokee can pick from those items and say, here it is. I've done mine. I'm going to go ahead and start working on this. So they love it because it does give them that ability to work through that if they choose to. Now, don't get me wrong. You might find out that your Scrum Master, whoever's actually doing this, says, oh no, Cherokee, I need you to work on this now. But at times, if it really is a self-directed team.
Yeah, this is really where that motivation comes into play.
Yeah, because it's like what we've talked about this before too, that if we really enjoy the topics that we're teaching, it's like we add a little bit more in there.
That's right.
And it's not that we're just competent at. Don't get me wrong. We like everything that we teach, but there are areas that we're really good at.
Or passionate about.
About. And so that's the idea here, is that if we have projects like that, it really does motivate us to be able to work on things that might actually be incredibly productive in that sense as well. So when you start seeing this type of backlog, there's usually 2 basic methodologies here on the backlog. Okay, one is that work is pulled from it, what we call iteratively, and that is the idea of what we call the Scrum methodology. Okay, so that's where Scrum really does come in. It says, all right, here it is. You only pull from this section here. But there's also other methodologies that also come into play. You might hear about Kanban, which is actually saying, all right, we'll just continue to add to this list, and you pull from it, as things actually develop along the way too. You name it, it's always there too when you start talking about these iterative approaches as well. The other thing about for us here in Agile and in terms of Scrum, now you might go, why did he start talking about Scrum? Well, Agile really bases itself on this idea of this Scrum technique as well, and what we call sprints, which is again same ideas that come in play, but those are the terms that you'll generally see too. Is what we call continuous integration or continuous feedback. Okay, because of the way that we are working through this in that iterative approach, right? We have the ability to stop and ask, Like, is everything going the way that we want to? Okay, so changes are integrated in fairly quickly and easily because of those integrations, and we can now go, all right, is this good? And someone goes, no, that wasn't really what I was thinking about. It's easier to make what small changes along the way than to go at the very end and now you look at it and go, ah, that's terrible. I don't even want to touch it. You know, the whole thing that you have. So just kind of realize that is a part of it. Now, just because I said there isn't any long-term planning to anything, doesn't mean that there isn't planning at all. Okay, so there is actually some planning that needs to go on, but a lot of times you actually do have to think about the idea of what we call sprint planning. Okay, is really what it's called, but in CompTIA land, they also call it Scrum planning as well. So you may hear those two terms that you will end up finding out.
Something that I've heard before also was the Kanban method. Is that similar there? With
Well,
manufacturing and keeping all the products in their bins and keeping the stock highly available, things like that.
Yeah, that's the same idea, is that somebody instead actually continues to realize, what the example that Cherokee is giving us is to make sure that we have all those products that are necessary to be updated, so that we don't run out of them during our products and manufacturing. So it is very possible that we have those things in place to go ahead and go realize that we have an automatic backlog that actually helps us to fill up and to actually pull and do the things that we need to as well. Okay. All right. Now, when we start talking about that sprint, right, the things that need to be in place here, we've got to make sure that we understand what's actually going to be expected for us, as well as the overall goals that we have here. Okay. When you set up a sprint then, okay, now this is where we have to go back to my screen just a little bit to help us out here. Estimate how long it will actually take us, for us to actually work through each story as well. So here it is. This is now where we're starting to schedule out things. Okay, we now need estimates of how this is going to end up happening. Okay, we then set priorities, and then we start the work as well for the iterations that we actually have in place. So here for the planning, you do need to understand the outputs that are actually going to be expected from your sprint. So normally we actually set up a sprint goal at the very beginning here. Okay, what are we actually expecting to be achieved during our particular 2-week sprint? Okay, now when I say that, you might actually list out like a paragraph of things, but what you want for your team is this. You want to be able to have them say a 1 to 2 sentence summary, okay, of what your team goal is going to be for that sprint. So that way when somebody asks, Cherokee, what are you working on right now? She doesn't have to go, well, let me tell you the technical details behind it. She can give a 1 to 2 sentence summary that now sticks in her mind of here's what my goal is going to be. Okay? We also want to make sure that the backlog that we have is normally designed for our particular sprint as well. Okay? And so usually along with the idea of the sprint and the prioritization, there is normally an estimate of how long that task is going to take. And then, of course, the idea that of what deliverable we're trying to accomplish, the user story that we're trying to accomplish. And then ultimately, right, the overall goal is now, this is something that's actually kind of neat. You as the project manager, you are not there just trying to say, here's what you better do. But because of the way that everything came together and it's a self-organized type of team, the working team is the one that tells you how much can be done in that time period. You don't get to tell them. I know this is kind of strange. Project managers love to say, here's how much work has to be done in this time. But in the way that Scrum works is like, here's how much we can really, literally and realistically, I should say, not literally, realistically accomplish, okay, in the time that we're actually given. And so it's the team members that actually decide that and what they can do during sprints. It's not an arbitrary decision by somebody enforcing an arbitrary time limit for what we actually have in place. So just kind of realize that there are multiple units that we actually do have to think about and realize when we start to take a look at the idea of planning out sprint meetings and everything else. So here it is. We're kind of at that particular point where you have at least the basics that are in place here, where we've talked about the differences, right? You understand the waterfall versus the Agile method as well. And then some of the elements that we've talked about, these are actually key terms that you might want to make sure that you know for the exam too.
I think that about wraps it up for today, Ronnie. We've been able to go ahead and look at our identifying our Agile basic methodologies. You introduced us to the concept of our sprints and how important it is to choose a really qualified team to go ahead and achieve those sprint goals. You were also able to go ahead and show us how a backlog is useful in this particular situation, in addition to sprint planning, how we're really just looking at those smaller, workable, manageable units instead of planning the entire project. Moving forward, we're going to be looking at some more Scrum details, so stay tuned. You guys don't want to miss that. Thank you for joining us today here at IT Pro TV. I'm Cherokee Boos.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.